This is a whole series of papers. I'm going to show you. There's about a dozen of them, actually. Um, they emerge, and the title of the talk is actually "Despair, Unhappiness, and Age." And I think it's a topic that's kind of building. And I would say that perhaps the thing I'm most known for, probably, is trying to look for patterns in the data. I mean, that's sort of what I and Andrew and I especially have done for ages. And a lot of this has to do with the initial paper that Andrew and I wrote in 2008 called "Is Well-Being U-Shaped in Age?" And it followed from an earlier one we did on well-being over time. And this is actually quite interesting because I was sort of locked in Florida for several months, and this generated a splurge of papers, particularly because I got really kind of annoyed because there were a whole series of journalists and psychologists who basically said that these guys don't know what they're doing, and there is no such thing as a midlife crisis, which struck me as completely bizarre for two reasons. And the first is that, especially in the United States, there is this phenomenon that Case and Deaton have talked about, which is deaths of despair. And deaths of despair, especially relating to prime age, less educated whites. More increasingly over time, it's not just less educated whites, it's less educated everybody, but particularly that. So the phenomenon that suicide rates and particularly drug poisoning rates peak in midlife seemed like a big problem for anybody who's going to deny that a U-shape exists. So that was the first thing. Second thing is that people argue to me that, well, in all probability, it doesn't exist outside advanced countries. And there was a paper by Deaton and co-authors saying that the thing only existed in English-speaking countries. So that seemed to me a kind of a challenge. And then there were econometric issues about whether you should use longitudinal data and whether you should concern yourself with cohorts. So it seemed to me an honorable estate to go to. So these papers, there's 10 here, and we're going to talk about a couple more. These papers, and two of them coming out in the Journal of Population Economics #3, which is the one which is sort of the dominant thing we're going to talk about today. But that sets the path. So the first thing is that path is about there being a U-shape in age in well-being in every measure you can think of across time and across 145 countries. But since I wrote it, Klaus, I found that I didn't do it, but I found another one for Pakistan that makes 146. And I'm going to tell you another one, which is about Scotland. But the question is whether I can count Scotland as a country or not. And I haven't finally decided, but maybe I should get people to vote on it. You know, whether Scotland counts as country 146, but I'll leave that open. Okay, so that's the first part. The second part is, well, okay, if you look at happiness, what about unhappiness? Is there an inverted U shape in unhappiness? And the answer is that there is. And we've got another paper coming out in the Journal of Population Economics with Andrew Clark. It's on children, unhappiness, and family finances, which it turns out is about the fact that it appears that children make you unhappy, which is sort of a bit weird piece in the data, because if the children made you unhappy, why would you have more of them? So anyway, so the answer is that we show there that actually it's a great deal to do with the fact that little kids make you happy and older kids actually are really expensive. And once you control for the problems of finances, you get children coming in positive. Okay. And then there's a paper in Jebo where I've actually got the converse, which is the unhappiness in age. And then I'm also going to talk a bit about another way of specifying this. So obviously, happiness, it turns out, isn't that complicated a thing to look at, and we'll come to it in a second. You just ask people, how happy are you on some scale? And it turns out that doesn't really matter. But the other thing I'm going to talk about is a follow-up paper from these, which we've just got taken in the American Journal of Public Health, which is actually to think about, instead of unhappiness, perhaps extreme unhappiness. And it turns out that that's pretty important. So that's where I'm going to go. In 45 minutes, I'm going to cover a dozen papers, but just sort of tantalize and titillate. So here's the stuff about patterns in the data. And I think it's pretty remarkable. It's remarkable that I think this is one of the most astonishing patterns in the data in social sciences, And if that's the case, pretty surprising that, I mean, this is psychology, this is behavioral economics. And it's pretty surprising if the economists, and I think economists now pretty much have the view, that this is one of the most amazing patterns in the data, psychologists disagree. There was actually, I was pleased this week, in fact, that Freakonomics does a weekly panel, and they had a psychologist on, and the psychologist came on and said, there's been all this consternation. I think Blanchflower is right. So that was kind of pleasing. First psychologist to come on. But here's the stuff which is pretty interesting. Take every major data file in the world. So the BRFSS, the Gallup World Poll, General Social Survey, European Quality of Life Survey, European Social Survey, ISSP, World Value Survey, the UK Annual Population Survey, and I'm going to show you results coming from a new survey, Health Surveys of England and Health Surveys of Scotland. It's true in the longitudinal data, and in the unhappiness data, it's kind of interesting because is it nuanced by how you ask it? And the answer is it isn't. So in this paper on unhappiness, I actually have 20 different measures asking people, I mean, how do you define unhappiness? So 20 different measures from, I've had extreme mental ill health, I'm depressed, I'm worried, I'm sad, I'm downhearted, I got poor sleep, I lost confidence in myself, I feel a failure. All of that doesn't matter, you get the same basic answer. And I don't need you to look at this is just to impress you. It turns out that, so I have this now in the paper.
Sorry, Danny.
Yeah?
Have you moved to the next slide?
Yeah, I have. I mean, can you not see it?
Okay, because I think people can't see. I can't see it as well. So we haven't.
Okay, does that matter if you?
Now it's good.
If you do it that way. Okay,
yeah.
We'll have to do it that way. Sorry, we'll have to do it that way. So yeah, let me do it that way. Okay. So
if you so people had been only seeing you with the fish. So if you did anything before this,
I'll go back. I have to go back.
If you did anything before this, then
yeah, there was. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah. You should have told me. Okay, there's the fish. Here are the series of papers. I'm sorry. Can you see that now?
Yes, that's fine now.
Okay, so I said that's the papers that I talked to. The next thing is, let me just do this slide so people to see. Can you see that now?
Yes, that's fine.
That's fine. Okay, so this is the thing that I went through. That the data can be shown everywhere. I've talked it through, so it's not the here's a slew of countries, and why this matters is that I can show you this result exists. I mean, initially we did it for a series of advanced countries at the bottom. So basically, every European country, every member of the OECD, and 143 of the 193 member countries of the United Nations, excluding little ones like Liechtenstein and Monaco and various Caribbean islands. What I wanted just people to focus on, just can't cast your eyes over it, is that not only is there a phenomenon that this thing exists across countries, the minima are pretty similar. So the simple way I do here, and I'll talk about how I get it, the simple thing I do here in each of these countries is I restrict the sample to people under the age of 70, because clearly weird things happen after the age of 70 because of life expectancy differences and other things. So just to make life easy, start at 70 and put in a quadratic age and age squared and then solve out. And the thing that you get, which is pretty darn interesting, is that the minimum is around 49 or so, both in those 109 developed countries and across the advanced countries, the UK and the US, around 45, but very, very little variation, which is sort of surprising. So I'm going to keep going as long as you can see that. So this is how I do it. And I just want to encourage people that, there's a lot of different ways of doing this. And all of them basically give you the same answer. And then we'll go through and think about it. So in the 145 countries, I think it's appropriate to do things separately country by country. So I do it lots of different times and different ways. So if you take the World Value Survey, and there are 6 sweeps, I do it for each individual country in each individual sweep. So every single time I have a data file on a country, then I run this thing. What's interesting is there's very few cases where you don't find it. Okay, so that's the first thing. How I solve it is I put age and a square in and solve for the minimum. But obviously you worry that that's sort of imposing structure that you may not want to do. So what I do is, and it's a bit hard to do this when you have a small sample size of 1,000 people from Swaziland. So I tend to use the first. The second one with the biggest samples, you can actually include a full set of single year of age controls. So between 16 and 70 or 80, whatever, each year of age is a single dummy. And you put that into the regression where the dependent variable is 10-step life satisfaction, 4-step happiness, any number of measures. And the other thing to say is that I have a series of these papers. There are lots and lots and lots of different measures, which actually are intriguing, including lots of measures about trust. What do you think about the economy? What do you think about democracy? What do you think about your family? It turns out that this phenomenon applies in almost every attitudinal question you can think of. And I'd never really understood that stuff that I did as a central banker and I do as a macroeconomist. I look a lot about, what do you think is going to happen to your finances? What's been going on with the economy? How do you think the economy is going to go? All of that has U-shapes in age in it, and obviously warrants more attention. What I do in every case is basically try and show you that the way you can run it, you can just run it in the raw means. What I tend to like to do is I've certainly pooled you across years or something. I just run the thing with year dummies and state and country dummies, and I usually call that limited controls. And then I try and vary it and say, well, what happens if you add some controls? And I try and do it consistently in everything that I do. So the controls I do, because I have them in almost every study, is I put in labor market status, marital status, and education. The results don't seem to be driven by cohort effects. There was some suggestion that they should be, but I think the literature, and I don't want to spend a lot of time in it, but I think the literature, Andrew Clark's written on it, and lots of others have, and I spend quite a lot of time in the papers looking at it. When you have these really nice long runs of data, you can put those in, and cohort effects, it seems, doesn't explain much. There is a bit of a story, which is that there's a literature started in the United States. We don't quite understand, and I'll show you a picture in a minute, that actually shows that the US, on the raw data, looks a little different. I would say that in everything you do, when you put in controls, there's a very, very good U-shape. In the United States, there's a slightly different pattern. You need the controls to generate the U-shape, and that's what Andrew and I said in our earlier paper. Outside the United States, Europe, the UK, especially Australia, you don't need, it doesn't really make any difference whether you have controls in there or not. We got a question, Matt Lube, the other day, in fact, before the seminar started, somebody asked about, does it apply to the U-shape? And I was able to give a great answer, which is that actually a great new paper, GLOW working paper, has actually been looking at people from the European Commission, has actually been looking at life dissatisfaction and anxiety in COVID-19. We've been communicating when it turns out that they have a U-shape in age in those data as well. So the answer is, it appears that it's relevant today. Let me just sort of go and say a couple of things. And this is, here's how the pictures look. So this is just this is an answer to the various psychology papers, which we'll talk about in a second. Various of these papers, which I've been writing answers to, trying to get all the psychology journals are basically saying there is no such thing, and we've been trying to send papers back to psychology journals saying that this isn't true, and they just reject them every time. So we're struggling and we're trying, but this seems to me to be a crucial set of pictures. So here's the picture where you just run a regression, where you take, this is on Gallup daily trackers, 2 million people in this, and people are asked the control life satisfaction question, which is about, on a score of 0 to 10, tell me how your life's turned out so far. Turns out that doesn't really make any difference if you ask in happiness, whatever, you get the same basic picture. And here's the picture that people in the US get concerned about, which is there's a drop to the early 20s in the raw data, then a pick up through the early 30s, and then the thing drops down and you get the U-shape in midlife. So there is that, but in the raw data, that's what you see in the US. And that picture is a bit different to everywhere else. A lot of the literature started when you took the GSS for the US, one of the early data files that people took. And in the raw data, they said, oh, happiness rises with age. And sometimes they sort of plot through this series. But if you put any sets of controls in there, you get that orange line, which is clearly, we'll call it a U shape, but it's a downward sloping, gives you a midlife low around 48, which is consistent with everything in our paper. This is this is not in the Journal of Population Economics paper. This is just building on it with a new paper from Carol Graham. So let me show you. So there's the first picture, and I want to get to a couple of other things. So here's the picture in the UK, and there is a little bit of a sign of the same thing in the raw data in the UK. A drop and a pickup in the raw data, say. So perhaps I exaggerated. There is a little bit of this dip here, but when you run controls to the UK, so this is from the official data from the UK. It's included in the labour force survey, and there are 4 measures. I just took the life satisfaction measure, but I certainly think you would be, if you're a psychologist, it's pretty hard to argue that that's not true. And then one more, and then we'll maybe stop and take some questions in a second. So if you take the one thing that people have done, and you can really get some really nice micro data, and you can get data back to 73, is what I call the 4-step life satisfaction data. And if you go to the World Database on Happiness, you can extract these numbers across. But you can't do it by age, but this is the source of those numbers. So take the micro data. So this is the file that was used in Blanchflower and Clark, and just take those data and run the thing without controls and with it. And you see this U shape, or maybe even V-looking shape. It's clearer with controls than without them. But I argue that if you just plot it, you can see it downward slopes and then picks up in midlife and does stuff later. I mean, you can see in the raw data, if you get up to 75 or so, it turns out it turns down. One of the reasons I tend to like to look at things under 70 is obviously there are issues about health as you get older, closeness to death as you get older. But obviously the big deal is that approximately, so think of each of these plots, there's 2 million people in this plot. So each plots of, I don't know, got 20,000 people in each of the plots. But as you get older, then those sample sizes get smaller. But it seems, and I'm going to get to it in a sec, and how are we doing for time? We're doing okay. And if you go to obvious various sets of regressions, you can see this. But I like to look at the plots. One thing I should just say to set this up to people is that it turns out this is pretty darned important. In fact, I just wanted to set it up, and this is exactly consistent with the paper in Glow. And I just want to say to people, this seems something, I just wanted to throw it in there and show you. This is pretty remarkable. So the question I just wanted to put in, and I'm going to stop Matt over in a minute just to take some questions, but I think this is actually really interesting. So this is a series that's available in YouGov for the UK every it's averaged over a 3-day period, been running since June 19. And basically they say, are you happy or not? So essentially what you had for a really long period from 19 through beginning of March 2020 was, let's say, a mean of 52. But actually what's happened is that if you look at these data, in the very early part of March, this series collapsed before the lockdown came. So this series went from 50 in the beginning of March to 25 in the first 2 weeks of March. But what's happened since then is that there's been adaptation. So this series looks to be, so we're up here, but adaptation has come to the lockdown. We have never seen anything in the happiness data like this before. We never saw any collapse in the happiness data in 2007 or 8. And I just want to sort of put this to people and show you something else. So if I go back to my series for the UK, if you look in the UK, the average of this series is about 7.7, right? If you just look at that plot, this is the average. This is the life satisfaction question in APS. If you now look at there's a UCL study, and they've been plotting happiness and well-being. It started about 2 weeks after that drop. And basically what's really sort of sad and surprising, and they've done it every week, is that every graph looks like this. they're all flat as a pancake, right? So what's happened during this lockdown is it looks like nothing's happened, but actually this is just not true. And I just wanted to say this to people, because if you look, this is exactly the same question that I just showed you, taken from the labor force survey, which had a mean of 7.7. They started this on the 24th of March, and it's been flat as a pancake. But what they missed was, look at the mean. The mean is 5.7. This is dropped two full basis points in life satisfaction score. So the problem is that most of these series and most of the studies started at the lockdown, but actually, here's for social science. This period here looks to be hugely important. So I thought I'd get to that, and then move on here a bit to the next thing. So Matt, if people want to ask anything or jump in, so that was just setting it up.
There is one question in the chat, Danny, if you want to have a look at it.
Oh yeah. Let me see if I can. Can I find it? Oh, I can't find it. Turns out. Can you tell me it? I can't see it for some reason.
It's quite a long question. So presumably the slope of the function either side of the minimum varies across countries. Where it's shallow, the minimum is, I guess, imprecisely estimated. And it would be interesting to know if your countries where the minimum is far away from 49 do indeed have such shallow profiles. So my question is, is any difference in the steepness of the profile either side of the minimum explained by any observed variables?
Right. I mean, that's a whole set of projects to get to. I agree with that. I haven't really done a lot of it across country. One of the major issues amongst psychologists, which is actually a really great point to ask it, one of the big issues by psychologists was, even if it exists, it's trivial, right? So it's exactly the same thing. The amount of drop is so tiny that it doesn't matter. And I think it's really worth exploring, but I think we've got a really interesting thing to look at. If you look at the scale of the drop so let's think of the scale of the drop I just showed you, which is why I showed you that graph. The scale of the drop from the lockdown is about two life satisfaction points. So let's imagine that's the biggest thing we've ever seen. If you look in the UK and the US and in Eurobarometers, the drop from age 16 to the minimum around 48 is about 1. It's about 1 life satisfaction point. Well, and some of the stories is actually bigger. The drop is actually bigger than if you look at the mean satisfaction score in the UK for being married compared to being widowed. It's also, the drop is also bigger than the drop from being employed to being unemployed. So I think it's a great question. The evidence that we've done so far, and you can do it across all of these countries, is a completely sensible project. But it looks to us that psychologists have completely lost the plot, that it's really big. But it's a great question. I've only done it for a number of countries. I haven't done it for the less developed countries. Clearly, you can do that, and I haven't. But I think it's a really important question. And as I say, if I can show you that the drop from youth to this minimum is about half the biggest drop in things we've ever seen, I think it's not trivial. But it's a great question. I hope I've done my best. Okay, let me go on, because I want to show you something which I think is pretty interesting, and I'm going to spend time on that. So this is this new paper with Andrew Oswald just coming out now in the American Journal of Public Health, and we were sort of interested in, could you really think, instead of thinking about the averages, so this is average life satisfaction, what about the extremes? So this is a paper about, we wanted to call it despair, but the paper's not, we had that initially in its title, but let me 1003, it's not 1002, but anyway, 1993, sorry. So here's the thing we're trying to look at, and this is really gives you the foundation to Case and Deaton's deaths of despair. they actually don't in their book. They don't actually tell you very much about despair. They tell you about deaths, and they make sort of the morbidity stuff is pretty weak in there. And they sort of said, oh, well, it must be that people commit suicide and dying of drug overdoses, they're in despair. So we thought perhaps we should go look at measures of despair. So here's something I think is pretty interesting and why I got into AJPH. So this is a question. So this is a question about, think about your mental health. This is in the BRFSS. It's got 8 million respondents. And this is U-shaped in age. This is astonishingly inverse U-shaped in age. And this is the question, thinking about your mental health, which includes stress, depression, and problems with emotion, for how many days during the past 30 was your mental health not good? 2/3 of the sample just say 0. About 85% of the sample say between 0 and 2. But nobody previously actually spotted there's a huge chunk of people who actually say 30 of the last 30 days were bad mental health days. And that seems pretty astonishing. So this paper looks at that as part of this story about happiness and age. Let me just show you the data here, which is pretty interesting. So it turns out that this is, if you like, because of the happiness data, we'll call this extreme distress. It turns out that in 1993, 3.6% of people said that they were in extreme distress. That's 30 of 30. And about 6.5% now. So it's more or less doubled since 1993. What's telling is that people who've got a high school grads and below, it's about 8.6. But here's the story that really gets you. It turns out that the paper shows this is very inverted U shapes. But actually, the group that the U shape is the worst for, I can just plot them, is this group here, and this is pretty interesting. So look at the blue line. The blue line relates to people who are ages 35 to 54, so the prime age, college, non-college. So the blue line is prime age, less educated, whites. And that measure of distress has gone from 5% to 11.5%. So by 2019, 1 in 8 less educated whites sitting at the top of their happiness function report being in despair. I mean, these are Trump voters. These are various other. This is the phenomenon of the deaths of despair, and we run a series of regressions in here, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about that. So what we're interested in is, well, who are these people? Why are they in despair? What's going on? And it turns out that we can map to the file. We got state year data. We can map to the file the proportion manufacturing, and we can show you. And that's obviously the decline in manufacturing is a big part of this story of despair. And it turns out that the level of this is proportion manufacturing in total employment in the state year cell enters negatively in a white equation and has no effect in a non-white equation. In fact, has the opposite sign, but is insignificant. So this seems to us, so I essentially go through, I haven't really got the time to do this. The last thing I just wanted to show you a set of equations, and then we can kind of finish. So this seems to be a worthwhile way to go. And so I just last week decided I would just do this. I found some new data. Could I show you how this kind of works, and then get to a regression? Just do it for one country. So this is what a life satisfaction equation looks like across countries, and what a U-shaping age looks like. So here's just the way of showing you this. A new survey that no one's ever used before, which we took this week. So in Scotland, there's a thing called the Scottish Health Survey, and this is what a U-shaping age and a happiness equation kind of looks like. And I thought I would just show you it, because in the 145 country paper, we don't have the time to do it for every country. So here's the way that this is what I would call just to show you it, a limited control. So you put in a set of a set of age dummies, with the youngest one, the excluded. And what you'll see across all of this is that this age category here is always the biggest negative compared to the excluded category, which is the young. And obviously I vary things here, and the data has all kinds of nice stuff in it. And I think the thing that you'll see here is the stability in many ways of these estimates. So then you add year dummies, education dummies, marital status dummies, labor force status, income, BMI. And so those are there's the pattern in the data, just for you in the sort of regression framework to have in your head. And then what we do in this paper is we go and say, well, let's compare it to England. Let's do it for other things. And you can actually take the annual population surveys. I'm sorry, it's got messed up it's yes across the board. You could take the annual population surveys, and I'll just show you that, well, supposing instead of taking the question on life satisfaction that I just had in the first one, which is the same question used in the annual population survey, you can take the annual population survey for the UK, separate it out, just do it for Scotland, the life satisfaction, happiness, worthwhile, and anxious, and basically you get the same. It doesn't look any different. But I also want to encourage you that, I mean, this is quite an amazing phenomenon, and we can nuance around. Oh gosh, it got tabbed across again, but don't worry. So then I'm essentially gonna finish on it. But so here's another way of doing it. So instead of asking, how happy are you? So there's a famous measure of unhappiness called the GHQ score. And it's 12 variables, all scored from 0 to 3. And people are asked, how unhappy are you on a scale of 0 to 3? And the GHQ 36 score, you just add them up. So this is an unhappiness score. And what's sort of remarkable, because most often we don't have the same score in both places. So this Scottish Health Survey just came out, and you can show that exactly the opposite occurs. So when you look at this age band 45 to 54, it turns out that just with the life satisfaction where the prime age estimates were at the minimum, in the unhappiness equations, the prime age estimates are at the peak, just as they are in the American distress data. And the other thing which is kind of interesting, and there's a paper with Andrew Oswald and Sarah Stewart Brown, where actually in the happiness equation, we find unbelievably strong evidence that people's eating of fruit and veg actually has a big effect on their happiness and unhappiness. So doesn't matter which the data set is, doesn't really matter what the measure is. If you take happiness or unhappiness, you get the same thing. I haven't shown you the cohort stuff, but that turns out to be much the same. And you get the plots for Scotland, just like I showed you for the other countries. There's life satisfaction in Scotland using the APS. And there's the GHQ score plotted as we had before, and then a turn down to 70, and then squiggles, perhaps an uptick after 70. So I've got about 3 minutes left, and anxiety does the same. And I'm just gonna, and in fact, I've got stuff as well. That in fact shows I've got new data for the US. Got a new paper coming, which I'm working on. Turns out that short sleep has a very similar pattern. So short sleep, there's a huge literature. It turned out I didn't really know this. There's 4 journals on sleep and sleep research. Well, it turns out that obviously we want to see this happiness stuff correlated with real world things. So it's correlated with deaths of despair. It's correlated with drug poisoning deaths and suicide. Turns out that the highest point of unhappiness turns out to be the highest point at which people have short sleep, defined as 7 hours or less a night. So I think all this work is going to be interesting, because people are now starting to think about how does it relate to things. And obviously the issue partly is that we know that there's a high correlation between short sleep and the probability of being depressed. And that looks very similar. There's obviously a big issue about which causes which. And the literature, as far as I can tell, assumes that both things occur. All these sleep researchers assume that short sleep leads to depression, depression leads to short sleep. But principally the relation is from short sleep to depression. But the fact that you can show, for the same individuals, you can show a very similar pattern between short sleep and depression. So I'm just going to kind of finish off with this just this and sort of say, so the various of these researchers in get rid of that, I think, hopefully. Okay. So these researchers in psychology have actually argued, so here's the thing, the conclusion, make sure I can read, yeah, the conclusion that the decline in happiness from late adolescence to midlife, they said it's premature and possibly wrong. I think that's complete nonsense. I don't think I've ever seen evidence of the kind that I've shown you so utterly consistent. Death of despair, sleep, happiness, unhappiness, no matter how you look at the data, no matter what you do with it, you get the U-shapes. So psychologists say that there is no U-shape. Pretty weird. So I think that midlife zenith and well-being seem to occur in the data, and especially it looks to be important for people at the very extremes. So our extreme measures of despair. I mean, think of that, 30 of the last 30 days have been bad mental health days. That seems pretty extreme. So we found evidence across all these countries. We found evidence that the minimum is around 48. And the finding of a U-shape, I think, is one of the most robust patterns in social science. It's very interesting in a sense. And Matlu was telling me a story a minute ago about a grant that he put in the discussions between the psychologists and stuff. How different we are. Their studies of a few hundred people. This is the data. The files that I've looked at, I think, are about 20 million people. Seems to me a very interesting place to be. That economists essentially have the view that this is an unbelievably robust pattern. We work in the field of psychology, and psychologists don't believe it. Thank you.
I like that last picture.
Which one?
Danny, could you show the one, the golf course you're looking for your board?
Oh, the golf course. You want to see the golf course? Yeah, yeah, that's Klaus. Klaus and me. It's actually David Bell and me. We've been golfing buddies forever. And I think that sort of says it all. We've been social distancing all my life.
Well, thanks so much for a really interesting presentation, Danny. I'm sure there is virtual applause going around the world at the moment.
Can I do stop share and then I can see questions and answers
sure.
and everything?
So if anyone has questions, I think, so the question I asked you before.
That was Geraint's question.
Yeah. So there was a longer question. If we want to kind of, maybe let's unmute him and see if there's.
It's a good question, Geraint. So just to tell everybody, I know Geraint. We were graduate students together, shared an office at the University College Cardiff. When was it, Geraint? 1981 or something?
I can't find him now. Where is he?
Something like that. So I know this man. He's a man. I hope he's wearing a nice tie. Speak to me, Geraint.
He has disappeared, it seems. He has left.
Disappeared. He's left. All right.
So there was another question. Did you see the one below that about
what's baseline fruit and veg? Yeah, it's no consumption of fruit and veg. I mean, it's actually one of them. Yeah, it consumes no fruit and. I'm sorry, I'll just share it with you. Shoot. Oh, hang on, I've lost me. Where are you? I've lost it. Sorry. Let me share the screen again. Yeah. Can they see that? Yeah, it's no fruit and veg. I mean, it's quite astonishing. I mean, in everything you ever do here, the consumption of fruit and veg, and we got stuff like in the earlier paper, we got stuff like control for exercise and drinking and smoking and all that stuff. And it turns out that this pattern of fruit and veg, and Andrew's got a paper a longitudinal study of consumption of fruit and veg. I mean, it does. If you look at it, it looks like the optimal amount of fruit and veg is between 7 and 8. 7 to 8 portions a day. I mean, as I say, we have a paper in Social Indicators on exactly this, and I'm always shocked because most of the surveys don't have anything, so the health surveys do, and it looks like eating fruit and veg makes people happy. Not something I would have, I don't exactly love broccoli, but what the heck? More.
Well, I saw that 11th May, the data that you're showing when the lockdown stopped, and I can tell you that my happiness went up quite a bit because the golf course is reopened on 11th of May.
Is that? Yeah, but I think in a sense, what it's what this suggests is that the adaptation that's going on and the move in these data suggests that people listening to this is something worth going to think about and look at, because all the surveys are flat. But what happened was we had this, I mean, we have never seen anything like that drop in well-being. So what this is done at UCL by Andrew Steptoe. In a sense, they missed. If you look at, they publish them every week. There's 8 of them out now, and they're all really boring. Every one of these things is flat, but it's flat at levels we have never seen before. And I think the research that people are putting out are really pretty darn good. But it's about, what we're seeing is adaptation to the shock. You're now adapted because the golf course opened, right? But yeah. I think I mean the issue is where do we, how are we going to understand what the effects of the shock are? And I think these data are pretty important. But it's we've missed it. It actually occurred. The fact that it occurred. This is the biggest dip. The only comparable dip is a paper by Miles Kimball, who looked at daily data on Hurricane Katrina and showed that as the pictures of Hurricane Katrina appeared on the TV, for 3 or 4 days, American happiness fell. And once it took off the screen, it came back. And if you tried to look over time, you know, what had happened to life satisfaction changes over time, the answer was nothing, because you'd missed the drop. But I think the fact that all the data that the Steptoe has, basically everything's flat and at levels we've never seen before.
We have somebody raised the question, so I'm going to allow Elena for you to talk, so you can ask your question, Elena.
Hello.
Hiya.
Can you hear me?
I can indeed.
Well,
thank you for your question.
Thank you so much. This is so fascinating. I've been doing, especially your finding about these manufacturing effects.
Right.
We've done some work on Ukraine looking at how past labor market shocks, when people lost jobs, when the factories were closed and so on, in massive layoffs, how that affected obesity, alcohol drinking, tobacco smoking,
absolutely.
that kind of things.
Exactly.
And what we did, we used growth curve models, and we used a quadratic shape of the age, and then we got the interaction. And basically what we are studying is the interaction, how the people who were affected have different age trajectories in those variables compared to those who didn't. But then, I just stuck in, it's not in the paper, I'm now working on the revisions, but this is just kind of additional variable that I checked, the life satisfaction. And it's amazing how far it has taken people. It's still U-shaped, but the deep is much lower than Yeah, I mean, so I find it really what
that's really interesting.
Fascinating.
Obviously the question going forward now is going to be which groups are particularly affected. I mean, I was looking at data yesterday, just looking at a question. So the Census Bureau has been doing things like this, trying to ask people on a daily basis, and just asking, the question from yesterday is, what do you think is going to happen to your income over the next month? That was asked like 2 days ago. And everything relates to it actually turns out the least educated think that the things are going to hit them the most. I haven't actually seen it by age, but the one thing in America which really stands out is by health. The less healthy you are, the more you think your income's going to get hit. And obviously it relates by income. But I think, in the US, the big deal in our manufacturing results is that manufacturing was something that less educated particularly white men aspired to, right? Yeah. You could go work in the car plants. I mean, it relates to your point. You could go work in the car plants. In Northern Ireland, the Protestants worked in the shipyards. When the shipyards closed, it had no effect on the Catholics because they never worked there. And in this, it turns out that the decline in manufacturing is basically a white phenomenon, right? That's what, it sort of relates to what you're talking about. We show that the non-whites didn't work in manufacturing. They didn't work in the car plants. They didn't work in the steel plants. So I think there's this whole thing about differential impacts and particularly does it hurt the prime age? I mean, in our data, it's the prime age whites, less educated, who get hit by this manufacturing shock. So I think it's really interesting. Please send me that stuff. That sounds really interesting.
Oh, I will. And thank you for this, consistency. One of the reviewers made a remark about, why do you do this quadratic? Let it, be different. Just allow, so I can cite your paper now.
Well, no, I think the answer to, I tell you why, what you want to do that. I mean, I as I've got older, I think economics has made such a terrible mess of itself. And it always sort of assumes that complicated is better, right? Well, simple is better. I mean, in a way, the big chart that I showed you, yeah, we could draw all kinds of things and you run the regression and all that. You've got 146 countries. But if you just say, the midpoint low in Ukraine is 43, that's it's a nice way of proceeding. I mean, so a lot of the papers I look at, take the quadratic, take the other, take the single year of age, plot them both, and basically what you'll see is that the quadratic, as long as you do it under the age of 70, is a pretty darn good measure. The problem is if you have something post 70, it might have 2 more squiggles to it, right? Yeah. If you leave it up to 90, it might go, and then the quadratic doesn't fit the early data very well. So cut it at 70, use a quadratic, say that's, and instead of even, because people can't understand what happens when you look at a negative age coefficient and a negative age coefficient and a positive age squared, translated into a single number. And I think that the simplicity is pretty.
I don't know if that would help as well, but with this random coefficient, so growth curve model is basically a random coefficient.
Yeah, right.
So we've basically allowed people to have their own age trajectories and then got the average with the variation around it, and it's still quadratic. So
exactly, yeah, you can take the individuals and average them and present some. Present a picture, but actually, in a way you want to be able to summarize it, don't you?
Yeah.
I agree with that. Thank you. Thank you so much. Very, very interesting. But please send it to me.
Yeah, thanks. I will. Thank you.
Any other questions for Danny? We are okay. Just one thing, Danny. What's I mean, I can understand the psychologists use these, whatever empirical, so to speak, their models, but what's their theoretical kind of foundation for not age having no impact at all? I mean, what's the story there?
You're asking the wrong guy, but let me try and explain to you. I mean, there's 3 papers actually with Carol Graham, where we try to understand exactly that point, and try to understand what it is they don't see. I don't exactly understand. Some of it, I think, is that my friend told me that we were just talking about it. You talked about the small sample size. So the first thing is they take small samples. My colleague, a famous distinguished professor of psychiatry, told me that one of the things that actually happened, the big mistakes they made, was that most of their small samples are actually their students first. Yeah. Second thing, there's a whole series of studies coming out showing that replication in economics is an issue, but apparently it's 3 times worse in psychology. I don't quite understand it. It looked to me, this may be unfair, but it looked to me that most of the work had been done on samples of 500. So we're going to look at the life course from 16 to 80. Let's say there's 60 years. Well, that means you've got, 8 observations per single year of age cell. And they take a sample of depressed people and they say, oh, there's no evidence of variation by age. As far as I can see, I mean, this is bizarre. I do not understand. And a lot of the papers that have been written, so I'll give you what our papers show you, is that first of all, it's based on small sample sizes. Second, several of the studies that they actually cite to say that they don't find a U-shape, I went back and looked at the papers themselves and read the paper. I'm happy to send them. If you go and look at the original paper, a lot of them cite Inglehart as not showing a U-shape. So I went back and looked at Inglehart's 1990 book, and 12 of the 20 studies that he reports actually find it. And there's a site which says in his book, which actually says he finds it. So then I go back and get the data. You can get the data and you go back and you rework the data. And what they claim, and there's another paper by Veenhoven that claims they don't find it, you take the data and you find it. So maybe it's just incompetence. And then the latest paper with Carol, we go at a paper called Galambos, which actually looks at, it's quite astonishing. I mean, maybe it's just, I don't know. Well, I'll give you the story. The first is they go through a series of papers and say that they don't find U-shaped. And I go through each individual paper, and every one of them they say don't find a U-shape does. I mean, this sounds bizarre. They base a lot of the paper on a study that they did of 1,000 high school students that they followed for 20 years. So two things. Hard to tell you anything about a midlife dip at 50 when the sample only goes to 38. Second, attrition bias. I mean, I just think it's poor quality research. The attrition bias is pretty interesting. They start out with 1,000 people and they end up with 400. And Blanchflower goes back and discovers that the best predictor of who drops out is their happiness score at the baseline. So all the unhappy people drop out. They keep all the best high school students in. So I just think probably this is just very poor quality research, but there's a battering ram now between psychology and economics, and we are trying to batter the psychology journals saying, I'm afraid everything in this paper is wrong, and they don't really like it. But it would be good if others went and read it and see what they think about it. But I think the answer is that it's pretty astonishing that the field of psychology doesn't seem to understand psychology. I mean, that's a pretty aggressive thing to say.
Well, it's something that we could stop on because, you know, I mean, as you have shown that is in essence the reality of it as well, because, you know, you have
let's just say one more
clearly.
And what I show in the paper, I think for people it's pretty interesting. So I think how can you wriggle out of this one? If you go to the ONS website, and I just have half a page. You go to the ONS website, they post the national statistic in the UK, which is the relationship between age and life satisfaction. They do it for all 4 of the variables. And they show in the raw data on their website, this is the national statistic. They show a beautiful U shape. And then there's half a page underneath explaining why there are U shapes in age in all 4 of the variables. That's the national statistic. It's included in it's included in the same survey that calculates the unemployment rate. So I think, you know, obviously it's an interesting point to get to, but I think we as economists are entitled to say, well, this approaches that we use are sensible. Here's the data, wriggle out of that. And I just keep saying, well, tell me how you're going to get out of that one. Your sample of 400 says this, but here's the national statistic. Now you've got to explain. I mean, you can just go there. I show it in the paper. It's just, you just plot it as I showed you, a beautiful U. So I think we're, I don't know, maybe they have to defend themselves, but I'm going to keep battering away because I think they're completely wrong.
Good on you,
took on
Tony.
the wrong guy.
Good on you. Perfect timing. Thank you so much again. It was really interesting. And thanks.
And if anybody would like to email me, blanchflower@dartmouth.edu, send me anything. And if you want me to send papers or whatever, they're mostly on my website, but please email me. That'd be fine.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks to all the participants and all those who asked questions and listened to this thing. And we will have the next one on the 9th of July. More information closer to the time. Goodbye, everyone, and stay safe.
Bye.